Okay, here we go. Today's daf is Bava Kamma daf Mem Gimel. We are at the near the top of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Um, uh, we second line, Umre. That's what we're up to. But I think we need to do a little bit of review in order to because we sort of ended in the middle of a topic. We answered a question, but we were really in the middle of a topic. So let me share my screen. We'll go over exactly where we are so that we're all on the same page. So yesterday we concluded with the brisa in which Rabbi Akiva taught that the Torah, when it says, a man or a woman, in the context of an ox goring. So this is all in Parshas Mishpatim and Sefer Shmos. So it had already mentioned it in the first pasuk. So pasuk Perikav Aleph pasuk Kavchet says if a man or a woman gets gored and the person dies, that the ox is going to be killed and there's but the owner is going to be naki, clean, innocent, absolved. And then the next pasuk talks about that if the next pasuk talks about if the if the if the ox had gored previously and it was sort of warned and it was a muad, so then and the person died, well then the ox is going to be killed and the owner will also die. The next pasuk then says essentially that the owner pays damages, a kofar payment, and so that in fact we do not kill the owner of the ox. But the bottom line is that we had both pasuk kafchet 28 and pasuk kaftet 29 both reference a man or a woman, and so Rabbi Akiva said that this second reference is telling us that just as payment for a man's death goes to his heirs and not to his wife, so too the payment for a woman's death goes to her heirs and not to her husband. So Reish Lakish then explained, because that seemed to suggest, well, maybe a man doesn't inherit his wife, but we all know that a man inherits his wife. Indeed, Rabbi Akiva explicitly says that a man inherits his wife. So how come? So Reish Lakish explained that what's going on here is that these assets only become hers when she dies. So they are assets to which she is entitled in the future, but never actually entitled to while alive. And as a result, it's only assets that she's entitled to while she's alive that the husband inherits. The other materials that she's entitled to or don't actually get inherited by the husband. They're considered part of her estate, separate from her husband, and get inherited separately. So that's the story. So and so as a result, that's why the husband doesn't get it, even though the husband again would be entitled to assets the woman is entitled to when she's alive. And then we ended yesterday by citing a brisa with a question mark. We challenged the brisa. We challenged essentially Reish Lakish's explanation of Rabbi Akiva's statement in brisa number 1 with a second brisa, and the second brisa had 5 rules regarding a wife who was hit and caused to miscarry. So rule number 1 is that the payments for damages and pain go to the wife. Rule number 2 is the payment for the loss of the offspring goes to the husband. Rule number 3 is that if the husband isn't alive, the payment for the loss of the offspring goes to the husband's heirs. Rule number 4 was that if the wife isn't alive, the payment for damages and pain go to the wife's heirs. Now, this is the basis of our challenge, because we said, according to Reish Lakish, that if the wife is entitled to something while she's alive, so then that would be inherited by the husband. But these payments which we see in rule number 1, are entitled. The wife is entitled to them while she's alive. Yet this brisa says that they go to the wife's heirs and not to the husband. So we'll answer that question in a moment. But let's first get to the 5th rule of the brisa. And the 5th rule was that if the woman was a freed slave or a convert, meaning that she has no heirs, well, then the damager will get to keep the payment because there's nobody to whom that payment should go. So we concluded yesterday by giving the answer to this question. And we said that both Rabbah and Rav Nachman both explained that the payments go to the wife's heirs because this brisa is talking about a couple that's divorced. So now that we've said, however, that the Gemara, that this is the interpretation, that we're talking about divorce, so the Gemara is going to say that this interpretation raises problems with another one of the rules of the brisa, because we say that the loss of the offspring goes to the husband. But if they're divorced, maybe the wife should get a piece of it. And we're going to now explain why, even in the case of divorce, we're going to say that the wife does not get a piece of it. So let's take a look. And again, we're picking up with the second word on the second line of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. So Amrei, they responded to Rabbah and Rav Nachman and noted, Gerusha Nami Tifluk B'Dmei Vladot. If she's going to get a share of something, shouldn't she also get a share of the value of the offspring, meaning the payment for payment number 2? And especially if the husband's not alive, let that payment go to her. So Amar of Papa, HaTorah Zichzav Demei Vladot Labal. The answer is that actually the Torah tells us that the man always gets the payment for offspring. And it doesn't make a difference. Afilu ba'aleha business, even if they had an out of wedlock relationship, even if they had an not necessarily immoral not necessarily illegal relationship, but they had an improper relationship, one that was not based on a marriage relationship. And my timer, what's the basis for our saying this? The basis for our saying this is the following pasuk: Amar Kra Kasher Yashis Alav Bal Ha'isha. That when it comes to the one who caused, this is a pasuk. This is from the pasuk in connection with this is also from Parshas Mishpatim, pasuk a few verses before the discussion of a goring ox, and it's just talking about where two people are fighting, and one accidentally hits the woman and causes her to lose her child, and the husband of the woman, the Baal, is going to get the payment for that lost child. And we use the word Baal there instead of Isha, instead of her husband, and that tells us that it's not just about her being his being the husband, but the interpretation would be afilu boel, that even if we take a look at Rashi here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines down, first words on the line, Baal Ha'isha, Aboel Hikpid. It's talking about the one who had relations with her and caused her to be pregnant. And so that's how we're going to understand it. So it doesn't make a difference whether their couple is married or not. The man who caused her to be pregnant is the one who gets this payment because the Torah basically dictates it. So now that we said all that, we have another question. Because why did Rabbah and Rav Nachman have to say that we're talking about a case of divorce? Because there is a separate debate that we will see in a moment. We're going to quote the debate in about 30 seconds, but we could use the nature of their debate to give us an alternative understanding of why certain assets might go to the husband's heirs and or the wife's heirs, and not be included in assets that would go to the husband, and meaning that they're not, that even though we might say that she had a claim to these assets while alive, we will say that nonetheless, when they come to her after her death, we're going to treat them as if they were assets that she was only entitled to after her death. So let's take a look and we'll see. The Nokma Rabba Kagon Shagavu Maos. Why not say that we're going to say that Rava, that this brisa that we cited up above, where it says that the payment if the wife isn't alive, the payment for damages and pain go to the wife's heirs. Why not say that that's talking about where the wife's heirs were taking money, according to Rabbah? And Ula Rav Nachman Kagon Shagavu Karka. And when Rav Nachman interprets this line, he should just interpret it as when they're talking about collecting real property. And why? Because we have the following debate. And now, as further background to this debate, well, we'll take a look at Rashi. Rashi will help us with that. To Amar Rabbah, because Rabbah said in this debate with Rav Nachman, Gavu Karka Yeshlo. This debate is a debate about the right of a firstborn to receive a double portion. And and similar to the issue that we talked about in Reish Lakish's statement, where what matters is the woman entitled to the asset while she's alive or only after she's dead? We have that same kind of issue with respect to the firstborn. When something is considered an asset that is already part of the estate before the father dies, so then the firstborn son gets a double portion in it. On the other hand, where something is considered an asset only after the father passes away, well, then the firstborn son does not have any special rights to that asset, and therefore it's considered an asset that would be split evenly among all the sons. So Rabbah says that when you have a property, real property that comes into the estate that the estate had a claim on while the father was alive, but only came in after the father died. So then the son, the firstborn son, gets a double portion. However, Gavu Mos Ainlo. But when the right, when the payment is being made in cash, is being paid in money, well, then the firstborn son does not have the right, because that is considered a prospective asset, not an asset that is a current asset of the estate. Let's take a look at Rashi. The next two Rashis after the Baal Ha'isha Rashi were right opposite the Gilyon Hashas on the right-hand side of the page. The Nukma L'Rabba, Lama Lahu L'Rabba, V'Lo Nachman L'Ukma B'Gerusha. So where Rashi is explaining the question, why did we need to say that the case in the Brisa that we raised, the case in the Brisa that I said is the second Brisa, the Brisa that says that if the wife isn't alive, the payments for damages and pain go to the wife's heirs. Why say that that's talking about a divorce situation? Lukma Marka de Islay, Umarka de Islay. Both Rabbah and Rav Nachman can each establish this Brisa like an appropriate viewpoint with respect to their debate regarding money and real estate. So B'yesh Nochlin in that Nukma L'Rabba Kagon Shagavu based in Mos Min Hamazik, because we could establish that according to Rabbah, we're talking about a situation where the Beit Din took money from the damager, L'Shalem Nezek B'Tzar, in order to pay the damage and the pain. And that's why the wife's heirs get it, because money, according to Rabbah, is considered a prospective asset and not a current asset. And even though that asset, meaning the fact that the mazik, the damager, was obligated to pay the woman while she was alive, lo adif mimalva b'shtar. There's no better. It's not any better than if somebody loaned money on a contract. And that's the situation where Rabbah says that if the money was owed on a contract, if it was paid in cash, it's not considered an existing asset of the estate. And so as a result, the firstborn does not get double portion. It's considered a prospective asset. And so as a result, similarly, when it comes to this woman who died, if she gets paid in cash, it's a prospective asset that goes only to her heirs and not to the husband. After all, the Amar Rabba, continuing next Rashi, Gabu Yorshin, Karka, when you have in heirs that inherit land, the Malva, when there's a loan, Shehilva Avian, that their father loaned out, Yeshlo Libachor Pishnayim. The firstborn gets a double portion. Dahavale Kamuchsach, because land is considered as if it's already held by the estate. Dahai Karka Ashtabile Avuhon, because this land is lien. It has a lien on it to their father. And so as a result, because their father essentially had some kind of property right, some kind of direct property right in the property, that's why Rabbah says that when it comes to collecting land, the firstborn will get a double portion. Now, on the other hand, we now go back into the Gemara where we say we're going to provide Rav Nachman's point of view, and we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down on Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, where we say the Rav Nachman Amar, middle of the line, Gavu Mos Yeshlo, Gavu Karka Emo. Rav Nachman takes the exact opposite position, and he says when it comes to cash, that's where the firstborn is going to be able to keep the double portion. But when it comes to real property, he doesn't get a double portion. Well, why is that? So Rav Nachman has a different perspective. Again, Rabbah's perspective was, does the father have a current, while alive, interest in the property? When it comes to real property, the answer is yes. When it comes to cash, money, the answer is no. And so as a result, that's why only when the estate takes in real property does Rabbah say that it's considered part of the estate already, and therefore the firstborn gets a double portion. And whereas when it's considered cash, it's considered a prospective asset, and the firstborn doesn't get a double portion. Rav Nachman says, no, that's not the point of view. Look at the nature of the asset that was lent. Right, and so take a look at Rashi, Rav Nachman Amar Gavu Maus Yeshlo, to Kimuksak Dummy, that when you have money that is coming, it's as if it's already held. Shahare Mos Hilva Avian Mos Nutlu. When the father lent the money, he lent money, and when the father, and now when the estate is getting the money back, they're getting money back. Might not be the exact same coins. That's why Rabbah disagrees, but it's the same nature of the asset. And so as a result, Rav Nachman focuses on the nature of the asset and says that only in that situation. But the bottom line is that we end up having, according to both Rabbah and Rav Nachman, a particular type of asset that, if collected by the wife's estate, would not go to the husband, but would go to the wife's heirs. So why not just establish that our Brisa is talking about that situation? So Amre, Hani Mili Livnei Ma'araba Aliba Darabanan. So that the issue is that the debate between Rav Nachman and Rabbah about the kinds of assets that are coming into the estate, that was only according to the rabbis, based on a view from Eretz Yisrael. But the problem is that there's another viewpoint. And again, the rabbi's viewpoint is that sometimes an asset could come into the estate and it can be part of the estate. Sometimes an asset can come into the estate and be considered only a prospective asset. And so that's why Rabbah and Rav Nachman have this debate. But Kika Amri Hacha, when Rabbah and Rav Nachman are talking about this brisa, it's Karebi. The issue is that there's another viewpoint, and Rebbe's viewpoint is that it doesn't make a difference whether the nature of a debt that's owed to the father is inherited is taken in as cash or is taken in as real estate. In both situations, the firstborn son is going to get a double portion, and as a result, it doesn't. And that's the way both Rabbah and Rav Nachman would paskin. And so as a result, from their perspective, when it comes to this brisa, which we want to attribute to Rebbe, they don't want to talk about the nature of the property because that would only be according to the rabbis. And they don't agree with the rabbis when it comes to the final line. So as a result, we've now explained all the different pieces. It's very complicated, I recognize, but hopefully by working through it slowly, we were able to get the details. That the bottom line is that we're trying to attribute it to Rebbe. Rebbe does not make the distinction between nature of assets, and so as a result, he needs to say that we're talking about a situation of divorce. Okay, new law, new rule. So now the Gemara is going to qualify when the owner of a muad ox will be liable for the 30 shekel payment for killing a slave. So Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Shur Shehemis es ha'eved, Shelo b'kavana, Pater mishloshim shkalim. That if the slave is killed unintentionally, and we are going to come back to this issue at the end, it will be then there will be no obligation to pay the 30 shekel payment that is for a slave. How do I know? Shneimar kesef shloshim shkalim yitain la'adonav v'ashol shor yisakel. That you only time that you pay the 30 silver shekel to the master is when the ox is going to be stoned, meaning the juxtaposition kolzman shashor biskila habalim mishalamim shloshim shkalim. That only when the shore is stoned will the owner be obligated to pay the 30 shekels, but Eina Shor Biskila, Eina Bala Mishalamim Shloshim Shkalim. But when the owner does not have to pay 30 shekel, so then there will not be, when the shore does not get stoned, well, then there will be no obligation to pay the 30 shekels. Now, Rabbah makes a similar ruling with respect to Kofar. Amar Rabbah, Shur Shehemis ben Chorin, Shelo b'kavana, Pater mikofer. That if, in fact, the ox killed somebody who was not a slave and unintentionally, then there won't be a kofar payment. We'll see that there's going to be a debate about that in a moment. But Shenemar, Hashor Yisakel, V'gam ba'alav yumat im kofar yushad alav. That if, in fact, the ox is going to be, then if a muad ox kills a person, the ox is going to be stoned, and even its owner shall die, and when kofar shall be assessed against him. Again, kolzman shashor biskila, ba'alim mishalamim b'kofar. Ein ashor biskila, ein ba'alim mishalamim b'kofar. So it's all dependent on whether or not the ox is going to be stoned, determines whether or not there's going to be a kofar payment. Well, Esvei, Abaye said, had a challenge. Because we have a Mishnah that was taught in Ktubot, Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, Hemi Shori es Ploni, that my ox killed somebody, Shoro Shel Ploni, or my ox killed that person's ox, Harezem Mishalem Al Piatzmo. The person has to pay based on his admission. But in this case, the ox is, is not going to be stoned. Because it was only on his admission that this is happening. And an ox won't be stoned based on a person's own admission. So, and what do we think? My love, kofar. Isn't this talking about having to pay the kofar payment? And so as a result, doesn't this mean that that Rabbah is incorrect? Because Rabbah said that if you don't kill the ox with stoning, you're not going to pay kofar. But here, the ox is not going to be stoned, and yet there will be kofar. So now we're going to introduce a new complication that will to the entire system that we have not seen to date. In connection with the payment of damages, because we've been assuming all along that the kofar payment is effectively damages. But lo, damim, the Gemara now continues, essentially saying that there is something else. That not only is there something called kofar where you have to pay, and again, remember that we saw a couple of days ago that there's a debate about this kofar payment. Do we pay the value of the owner of the goring ox, or do we pay the value of the person who was gored and killed. So now we're introducing that irrespective of that question, when there's damage, there would be potential liability for the damage that the ox inflicted on its victim, even and that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the payment of kofar. So let's take a look at Rashi and Tosfos here. So the Rashi is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 lines up from the bottom of the Rashi on the left hand side of the line. Lo damin hadikatani mishalim. That which this Mishnah in Ksubos cites that you have to pay. Lav b'taras kofar. It's not talking about the rule of paying kofar. Denibai kapara, that the person would, on some level, need atonement. Da'afilu lo mishalim nami, that even if he didn't pay, that he would still need some kind of atonement. Kagon ilesle nichse lav b'chal oneshu. Like if he doesn't have any assets, so then he's not capable of being punished. But he de'ain kover below skila, because there's no there because bottom line is there's in fact no kofer payment when there isn't any skila, the shore of the ox. Aval hecha de isle nichse. But when the person still has assets, even though there is no obligation to pay kofar and there's no atonement specifically needed because the ox didn't intend to kill, or there's no liability because we're dealing with a person's own admission, al kain mishalem damim, then he will still have to pay money. Delo gara misa minizakin, because after all, we shouldn't treat the killing of a person any less strict than the damage of the person. If the ox gored somebody and did some damage, the owner would have to pay. If the ox did damage to somebody and doesn't get skila by lishlume, there would be an obligation to pay damages lishlume pachat damav, the reduction in his value. So too, when the person actually gets killed, we'll have him pay the value of his value to the to his heirs. So now that was Rashi. Let's take a look at Tosfos right across the way, second to last Tosfos on the page. V'im tomer lamanda amar kofer demei nizak my ika bain damim lakofer. Listen, we had again the debate earlier on Daf Mem Amud Aleph about whether or not the damages that are paid are damages based on the value of the damaged person. And let's say that they are. In that case, what's the difference between damim and demei nizak? So Venira Lari, so the Re explains actually there could be differences. Kagon shemeis hamazik. If the damager dies, right? De'ein kapara lachar misa. There's no obligation for any kind of atonement after a person dies. Kamo chatas v'asham de'ein ba'in lachar misa. Just like when we have, if a person sets aside because they sinned a sin offering, they sinned accidentally, and they or they did an asham, they weren't sure whether they sinned, and so they set aside an asham again for atonement, or if they did one of the sins for which an asham is required. So in each of those situations, if the person dies before the offering is brought, we don't bring the offering. Aval damim mishalim. And so similarly, we wouldn't pay the kofar payment. But when it comes to a monetary damage payment, that we would pay. In that case, it would be more strict the damage that was done unintentionally than the damage that would be done intentionally. There's another chumrah, that where it would be more payment in a case of unintentional killing as opposed to conventional killing. Lamanda Amar Kofer Demei Mazik. If you follow the person where the damager is the one whose amount is payment that you pay. Depamim Shan Nizik Shava Yoter Min Hamazik. Sometimes the damaged will be worth more than the damager. And so as a result, you'll have a stricture in that way. The Odye Shlomer, the Nafka Mina Bain damim lakofer. That another difference that you could have between whether or not the payment is for damages or as a kofer payment. The damim, when it's payment just for the damages, yachol limchol. Made the victim has the ability to waive the payment. The kofer ain't yachol limchol, but when it comes to the kofer payment, he doesn't have the ability to waive the payment because the payment is necessary for the person's atonement, for the owner of the ox's atonement. So the ain the e have a pshita lan de kofer shalom, and moreover, if we say kofer shalom amarachmana, that the Torah only requires full payment of kofer, below chatzi kofer, and not half of a kofer, havanaka mina nami laha. So as a result, there would also be a difference when it came to a tam, that a tam wouldn't have any concept of chatzi kofer, but he could have chatzi damim. So all of those are important clarifications. So now the Gemara objects, however, to Rabbah's answer and says, "Idamim ema seifa." Well, what about the end of the Mishnah in Ksubot, where it says, "Hamid shori et avdo shal ploni enu mishalom al pi atzmo," that when it comes to a person who admits that their slave killed somebody, the person doesn't pay based on their admission. The idamim amai lo, and if we're saying that he pays that we're all talking about damages in both situations, why not? Why not have him pay? So Amar Le Yachil Nishlu Yelach. Rabbah explains to Abaye, I can explain this to you. Now, I could answer to you, Reisha Damim V'Seif Knas, that the first part is talking about money and the second part is talking about a Knas, and so we just are changing the situation. But I don't want to give you that difficult answer. So Idi the Idi Damim. Really, I can tell you that both cases are talking about damages, monetary damages, and not a penalty. So we're admitting that we're outside the category of knas, and so as a result, why is there damages payment only in the first case but not in the second case? So let's follow this and we'll see. This is a little complicated, so please bear with me. Okay, so because miu ben chorim de mishalem kofer al pi atzmo, because as we turn to Gimel Amud Bet. So when it comes to the first case that we're talking about a free person that is damaged, there's a situation where a person's own admission could result in the kofer payment. Because veheki dami, what's that case? If in fact witnesses come and say that your ox gored somebody and killed them, but I don't know whether your ox was tam or muad. And then you know what you do? You're a nice guy, and you say va'amar mari de muadhu, and you say, well, my ox was actually a muad. Well, in that situation, de mishalem kofer al piatzmo, you do have to pay kofer, because kofer is not a kanas. We're going to, as not a penalty, we're going to say that you would have to pay kofer in that situation. And so as a result, since there is a situation where your own admission will require you to pay kofer, we're going to tell you that when you make your own admission, you're going to have to pay damin. But but in a situation where when there wouldn't be any witnesses, you wouldn't. So therefore, and so exactly as I said. So therefore, even when there are no witnesses, if you admit it yourself, we're going to make you pay damages. However, Gabi Eved she'ein mishalem knas al piatzmo. There's never a situation where you would have to pay the 30 shekel fine because of your own admission. Because let's take a look at that same case of where you have these two the parallel case, the hechi dummy, right? Because in that same situation where witnesses come and say your ox killed a slave, and we just don't know whether your ox was a tam or a muad, and then the owner says, you know what? It's honestly a muad. Lo mishtalim knas al piatzmo, because again, that 30 shekel payment is a knas, is a penalty, therefore he won't have to pay it. And so as a result, since there's never a situation where you have to pay the 30 shekels as a result of your own admission, we are not going to make you pay damim as a result of your own admission. So we won't make you pay damim either when there are no witnesses and you make an admission. So that's the reason for the distinction. So now Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak is going to ask a question. So Masav Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Kol shechayev beven chorin chayev be'eved bein bekofer bein b'misa. We have a brisa that. So what do we distinguish? We have distinguished between and created a situation where there is liability for kofer, but no liability for killing a slave. But listen to what this brisa says. This brisa says that whenever there's liability for killing a slave, there would also be liability. There would be liability for kofer with respect to the death and regard to the death of the ox. So basically, this brisa is telling us that there should never be a distinction between kofer for a slave. So kofer, the Evan Mi'ika, is there ever kofer for a slave? No. Elalab damim. We're talking about the penalty, the damages for penalty of a slave. So how could you say in this answer that you gave to Abaye Rabbah, how can you say, Rabbah, that there's this that we can make a distinction between liability for when an ox kills a free person versus when an ox kills a slave? We have this statement that seems to say that there should be no distinction. So, Ikad Amri Hu Mosivla Vahu Mefarikla. So some people say that Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak answered his own question, and Ikad Amri Amrle Rabbah, and there are some who say that Rabbah was the one who answered it. But Hakiktani, but this is what the brisa meant, and so as a result, we won't have this problem because Kol Shechayah Beven Chorim Bekavana Alpi Edim Kofer Chayah Be'evid Knas. That whenever a kofer payment is going to be obligated with respect to a free person when the ox kills with intent, so then there will also be a knas payment for a slave. And whenever a free person would be, the killing of the free person would result in damages, again, damages as opposed to kofer, with respect to when there are witnesses that it was done unintentionally. So that's where there's going to be a damim payment, a payment of damages as opposed to kofer. So then similarly, then similarly also with respect to an eved, if it was killed without intention and you have witnesses, there will be liability. But what does this not cover? Significantly, this doesn't cover where there's an owner admission. And where there's an owner admission, there could be a difference between the liability for killing a free person and the liability for killing a slave. And so as a result, we've now reread this additional brisa. And so as a result, it does not conflict with Rabbah's explanation. And so as a result, Rabbah now has offered this explanation. Now, again, Rabbah has created this new idea that when there's no liability of kofer or 30 shekels, there could still be liability for paying damages. So Amrle Rava asked the question, how can you say that? Because if you're saying that, ihachi, isho, when it comes to a fire, shaloba kavana, when it kills something unintentionally, alpi edim, and you have witnesses, nishalim damim, maybe we should have the person pay monetary damages. Uminale the Rava de lo Mashalim. Well, 1 second. How does Rava know that you don't actually have to pay those damages when it comes to a fire? So we're going to have 3 possible answers. The third answer really isn't an answer. You'll see what I'm talking about when I say that. So let's take a look. So answer number 1, if you want to say that maybe he learned it from the following Mishnah, Hayagadi Kafot Lo, that there was a kid, a young goat that was connected to a haystack. The Ebed Samachlo. And then there was a slave that was near the haystack, the Nisrafimo, and everybody got burned and killed. Even though the slave was not tied, he just sort of didn't run. Well, then chayav. You're going to be liable for the fire that you set that burned the goat and the stack. But you're not going to be liable for killing the slave because the slave should have run away. But Evid kafut lo. But if you now have that the slave was tied to the stack of hay that's going to be burned, ugadi samachlo, and the kid is near it, nisraf imo, and the kid got burned with it. The kid goat got burned with it. So patur, then you're exempt because what have you done? You killed a person, and so as a result, based on the kumle b'derabba mine, you're not going to be liable for that. Well, 1 second. If so what would be the basis? So the bottom line is that it seems like, but maybe you should also, doesn't this show that you don't pay damages for the slave, even if it was unintentional in the first case? So the Hamaresh Lakish, Kagon Shehitzis Bigufo Shel Ebed, the Kamle B'derabamine. No, and the bottom line is that the the second clause is talking about where the slave's very body was set on fire, and so as a result you can't say that it was not intentional that you killed the person, because our first thought was, well, maybe we're talking about a situation where it was unintentional, and therefore the fact that you're exempt shows that there's no liability for paying damages when it's unintentional. So the Reish Lakish explains that no, that this Mishnah, which is a Mishnah that we'll learn down on Samach Aleph on Bet, that Mishnah is not talking about unintentional, but rather intentional, and so that can't be the source for an exemption for unintentional damages with respect to fire. The Elamiha Tanya. So maybe you'll say that it's from the following brisa: that a fire is more stringent and strict than damages through a pit. Because a fire is considered muad, meaning that you're going to have to pay full damages for things that are fit to burn and things that are not fit to burn. For example, stones and earth are not usually fit to burn, but if a fire does damage to the earth, we're going to cause you to pay damage. Masha ain kain babor, but that's not true with the pit. Now, the ilu sha'esh mishalemes shelo b'kavana damim. Now, if you were going to tell me that fire also pays for unintentional death, well, masha she'ein kain bavor, which is not true for a bore, lo katani. Why not say that this is another stringency? So, Dilma Tanavashire, maybe there were things that were left out, that even though this is one stringency, it was not intended to be a full list of stringencies. Now, usually we ask in this kind of situation, my shire to high shire. But the bottom line is we have a third approach that we're going to now explain what really is going on when Rava was asking this question. Ela Rava Gufe Ibauye Mibaile. Rather, really what Rava is asking is himself the question. He does not know whether the fire Isha Shalo B'Kavana Mimishalam Damim Olo. Does a fire that causes damage, that kills somebody unintentionally, does he have to pay the damages or not? Me, I'm reading Gabi Shor, who b'kavana mishalim kofer, shelo b'kavana mishalim damim. Do we say that it's only when it comes to an ox where there's a kofer payment for intentional killing? So therefore, we'll also make you pay unintentional damages. About Isha, when it comes to fire, the b'kavana lo mishalim kofer. When it was done intentionally, you don't pay kofer because it's considered your action. It's considered as if you killed the person. So of course we're not going to have you pay. There's no kofer because you are going to get the death penalty. So shalo b'kavana nami lo mishalim dami. Maybe even when it's unintentional that you kill somebody with a fire, you also won't pay damages. Oh, Dilma, or alternatively, kaven de gabi shower shalo b'kavana af al gav deleka kofer mishalim damim. That when it comes to an ox that kills somebody unintentionally, even though we don't make a kofer payment, we're going to say that he pays damages. So gabi ishonami, also when it comes to a person's fire, kofer, even though if the killing was done intentionally, he wouldn't pay kofer. He would still nevertheless have to pay damages. And v'lo yadinan. And the answer is, after all of that, unfortunately, we don't know. teku. We leave it completely unresolved. All right, so we're going to do one more piece of the Gemara, and then we'll conclude for the week. So ki asa Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kofer, Ma Talmud Lomar Im Kofer. We have the Torah doesn't just say Kofer; it says the words Im Kofer. Im Kofer Yushas Alav. When Kofer will be required of him. So why the word when? We could just say Kofer Yushas Alav, that Kofer shall be assessed. So Larabos, so what does it come to teach us? Larabos Kofer Shaloba Kavana Kofer B'Kavana. Unlike everything that we've been saying for the last few minutes, that actually when there's a Kofer, there's Kofer for unintentional killing, just like there's Kofer for intentional killing. And so as a result, there's no need to come to the question of Dumim for unintentional killing, because there's just there for damages, because just as when there's you pay Kofer for intentional killing, when the ox kills intentionally, you're going to have to pay Kofer when the ox kills unintentionally. And Amrle Abaye, Elamiata Evid Nami. Well, 1 second. Well, that should suggest, because when it comes to a slave and you have to pay 30 shekel, maybe we should also say that unintentional killing of the slave also leads to the 30 shekel payment, because Mal Talmud Lomer Im Eved, just as it says Im Kofer, it says Im Eved. So Larabos Eved Shalo B'Kavana Be'eved Ke'eved B'Kavana, that a unintentional killing of a slave should be included like in the intentional killing of a slave. And if you want to say that that's the case, but Reish Lakish is the one who specifically says that an ox that kills a slave unintentionally doesn't have to pay the 30 shekel. So Amrle Gavra Karamis. 1 second. You're asking me about Reish Lakish, but I'm talking to you about Rabbi Yochanan. So how can you tell me that Reish Lakish is a question on Rabbi Yochanan? They could disagree. So Ki Asa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Eved Matam Lomer Im Eved L'Rabos Eved Shelo B'Kavana Ke'Eved B'Kavana. And indeed, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that in fact he also holds the second drasha of Im Eved. So now, why doesn't Reish Lakish do that? Well, Reish Lakish Nami in Nema Mid Eved Im Eved Lo Darish. Why doesn't he say something about why doesn't he learn anything about Im Eved while Kofer Im Kofer Nami Lo Darish? So, and in which case he should also use Kofer Im Kofer to not do that drasha either. Meaning, why does he only have a drasha by Kofer but not by Eved? So Amri, so they said back to him, Lo, you don't have to say that those two things go along, because Eved Im Eved Lo Darish, Kofer Im Kofer Darish. He can say them. Umaishno, what's the difference? Why does he say one and not the other? Because Eved Im Eved Lo Ksiv to Shlumin. Because the words Im Eved are not in the context. Because let's take a look at them in the pasuk. It's pasuk parak again. Shmo parak of ala pasuk lamabet. Im Eved Yigach Hashor O Ama Kesef Shloshim Shkalim Yitain Ladunav. So the Im Eved is not talking about the payment. It's talking about the victim. The victim is the slave, and so as a result, it doesn't necessarily have to tell us that that's going to be a drasha, something to derive some lesson with respect to the payment. But kofer in kofer ksivim makom teshlumin. The kofer is the payment. So because again, in the next words, in kofer yushasalav, if the kofer payment is going to be put on him. So that's talking about payment. And so as a result, Reish Lakish could say that when it comes to the kofer, I'm going to tell you, you have to pay whether you're intentional or unintentional. But when it comes to the slave, you only have to pay if it's intentional. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan would say that whether it's the slave or the free person, it doesn't make a difference whether it's intentional or unintentional, you will be liable. So now the Gemara is now going to return to the Mishnah that we learned back on Wednesday, where we saw that when it comes to kofer, it does not make a difference whether the victim is an adult or a child. So the Gemara is going to detail how we know this and why we need to learn it from a verse in the Torah, given that it seemed, you would think it would be dictated by logic. But for that conversation, please stay tuned to tomorrow's daf. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. Have a great weekend, everybody.